time. Dr. Dermot Quinn is Professor of History at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey, in the USA. He's Associate Editor of the Chesterton Review, which he's going to say a few words about. There's yet another Chesterton organisation, a very potent force in the world, the Chesterton Institute, that he's going to speak about. He's a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and of New College Oxford. So we're very privileged with the level of academia that we get in the Chesterton world, where he took his DPhil in 1986. Professor Quinn is the author of 3 books and many scholarly articles. His works include Patronage and Piety, a copy of which I brought today. I must remember to get him to sign it. I'm a bit sad that way. Subtitle, English Roman Catholics and Politics, 1850 to 1900. And another book that I haven't got, but I'm going to get, Understanding Northern Ireland and the Irish in New Jersey. 4 Centuries of American Life. And he's also published and spoken extensively, and that's almost an understatement, extensively. Every year that goes round, I see these emails. They're sent to us by Gloria, who's the editor there, and runs things so professionally. All the various places around the world that Professor Quinn goes and speaks, and he's bringing Chesterton to far-flung places on Chesterton all over the world. And he's also published and spoken on Chesterton and the English Catholic revival of the 20th century. So I would like to introduce Professor Dermot Quinn.
Thank you very much, Martin, and it's just delightful to be here. Just let me say, first of all, that I propose to give my talk in Italian, and we'll throw in the occasional word of English just to make sure that you're still awake. I was intrigued this morning when Martin said that the timetable is a little tight. And I thought the conference is a bit like Chesterton himself. And after the lunch this afternoon, I'm just a little worried that the audience might be a little tight, as well as the timetable. Martin said that I would say a few words about the Chesterton Institute, and that's precisely what I will say. The Chesterton Institute is 40 years old this year. It was established in 1974, and its purpose was to, and remains to, publish the Chesterton Review. Now, in the back of the room this afternoon, you will see a few copies of the Chesterton Review. I think it's fair to say that they are selling like hotcakes. Well, 1 hotcake is sold already. I brought 3 with me. There are now 2. So you know, be the second. And like Martin's copy of my book, I will sign it for you. I'm kind of sad that way myself. So the Chesterton Institute has been promoting the work, the thought of Chesterton for 40 years, but as I think Martin kind of indicates, you know, it's a scholarly enterprise. Its purpose is obviously, in some obvious ways, celebratory, to celebrate the work and the achievement of Chesterton, but not simply Chesterton and his wider intellectual circle. So in that respect, the Chesterton Institute is about people like Christopher Dawson, who I think is a figure sadly neglected, but who should certainly be revived. It's about people like George Bernanos, people who've been associated with the English Catholic revival in the 20th century. So you can find this out for yourselves if you sign this little thing in the back. You'll see this. This is your chance to subscribe to the Chesterton Review. I brought lots of little copies of this, and it's a journal that comes out twice a year, and I think we're really rather pleased with it. So what we've been doing, this has been a kind of a wonderful conference so far, and what strikes me about it is in every sense, the Catholicity of our gathering. I mean, we've heard so many accents this morning. American accents, Italian accents. Now we have a Northern Irish accent. When we have two people from Minnesota, not just one, but two people from Minnesota, people famously called God's frozen people. It's great to welcome them to warm, bright, sunny Beaconsfield. But people from Minnesota, people from Italy, we have people from France, we have people from Poland, and that in a way is the reality of Chesterton. Chesterton, who's brought together so many people from all over the world. As I say, I'm from Northern Ireland, a place which is frankly a rather sad history in some ways of anti-Catholicism, as I'm sure you're aware. There was a politician a few years ago who once said that he wanted to burn every Catholic. So he was very quickly called a born-again Christian, and that's the kind of place that I come from. And I thought to myself, we are in the presence of greatness today for all sorts of reasons. I had no idea that I was going to be hearing stories of Dale Alquist's honeymoon when I accepted the invitation, and I've been looking around for Chesterton's first miracle, and I think it may well be that Dale is still married. The man who his wife reads Les Miserables, and he reads Chesterton on their honeymoon. This is a strange marriage, actually, when you think of Victor Hugo, you think of his wonderful definition of genius, which is that a genius is a man who reads with a microscope in one eye and a telescope in the other. And that, in a way, is Chesterton. Chesterton sees with a microscope in one eye. As Martine beautifully said, I mean, the God of small things is very much Chesterton, and he sees with a telescope in the other, for which read his magnificent masterpiece, The Everlasting Man, which I think is one of the great works of apologetic literature. We are in the presence of greatness. What I wanted to talk a little about is maybe more extensively than I should, is the question of, as I call it, wholeness and holiness in Chesterton, which is another way of introducing the question of Chesterton's possible canonization, which is very much in our minds this afternoon. Maybe the second miracle is not simply that Dale is still married, but that all of you will stay awake after the luncheon. Much has been written, and much remains to be written about the recently begun cause for the canonization of G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton's admirers, of whom there are many, have welcomed this news or have expressed in subtle ways some reservations about it. I'm now quoting Dale, a lot of people have been hoping for this for a long time, says Dale. Chesterton has a huge devotion around the world. And no further proof for this need be supplied than the excitement that the cause has generated from Beaconsfield to Buenos Aires, the twin cities, as it were, of the quest for Chesterton's sainthood. Well, to be sure, the enthusiasm comes with qualifications. A good man, or even a great one, does not ipso facto qualify for sainthood. Perhaps the time is not ripe for his elevation. Perhaps he should be considered, if not a saint, then a doctor of the church. Perhaps some disqualifying characteristic in his thought or his way of life stands in the way. Perhaps canonization would turn him into Catholic property when he belongs to the whole Christian world as a bridge of unity between evangelical, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox. When you were an Anglican, you were both a Protestant and a Catholic, an Episcopalian bishop once told him, and that was delightfully Chestertonian. Now you have become a Romanist. You have ceased to be a Chestertonian. How much more so would that be the case, the argument goes, if Chesterton were to become a saint? Christopher Howes, writing recently in the Daily Telegraph, praised Chesterton as a man who gave thanks for existence, who saw the world as incarnating the glory of God. But he wondered about him as a saint because he was, at the same time, too fat and too childlike. This is rather alarming news for admirers of St. Thomas Aquinas, by the way. It's actually rather alarming news for followers of Jesus as well. Melanie McDonough in The Spectator, acknowledging Chesterton's colossal kindness and humility, his respect, I'm quoting, his respect for the poor and disrespect for the rich, his magnificently effective arguments for Christian orthodoxy, nevertheless argued that to canonize him would be, and I quote, to put a big fat halo between his work and the reading public, forever, quote, I quote Melanie McDonough, forever burdening him with the approbation of the Catholic Church. You know, the Catholic Church's approbation is a burden. People would not read him anymore, she seems to think, or with the same pleasure and instruction if reading him on their knees. And this argument is less an objection to Chesterton than to the very notion of canonization, as if in evangelical terms, canonization is a sort of career-ending move to the House of Lords. I have reached the Elysian fields, Disraeli lamented when he became Earl of Beaconsfield. Becoming a saint might have the same deadening effect on Chesterton. For Howes, for Christopher Howes, Chesterton is unworthy of sainthood. For MacDonagh, sainthood is unworthy of Chesterton, and it's hard to take either argument seriously. Well, these prudential reservations, they are not alarming. It's why we have canonical inquiries. It's why the church must judge not only the fitness of the man, but the ripeness of his time, or of the time. It's why even frivolous objections must have their day. But other reservations about Chesterton as a saint have been more pointed. It was impossible for most people to take offence at G.K. Chesterton. F.A. Lee wrote in 1945, comparing him a shade patronisingly to David Copperfield's Mr. Dick. What Chesterton said of Browning, Lee said of Chesterton. He delighted with a true poetic delight in being conventional. Being by birth an Englishman, he took pleasure in being an Englishman. Being by rank a member of the middle class, he took pride in its ancient scruples and its everlasting boundaries. He was everything he was with a definite and conscious pleasure. Well, most people have laughed with Chesterton, who was not only a brilliant critic of Dickens, but almost one of his characters. But other people have taken offence. What Geoffrey Alderman has called Chesterton's much publicised aversion to Jews and Judaism seems to represent, if true, a darker side of his conventional Englishness and his much insisted upon pleasure in boundaries and fences. Well, voices have been raised and feelings hurt on both sides of this painful question. it introduces a note of disharmony that distracts from and seems disproportionate to the spiritual depth of the man. And perhaps all that need be said today is that saints are sources of grace, and one of those graces, in Chesterton's case, must surely be a renewed or rediscovered friendship between those divided by views that are easily misunderstood and made the subject of needless polemic. Making a saint ought to be a way of making all of us a little more saintly. Charity as well as clarity is called for. Well, let us agree then that the case for Chesterton requires more than the enthusiasm of his admirers, but that it should not be derailed by the prosecutorial zeal of his critics. From the point of view of the Church, it requires first, holiness of life, secondly, a well-established reputation for holiness of life, thirdly, evidence of widespread public devotion, and finally, it requires miracles. In the Apostolic Constitution Divinus Perfectionis Magister, Blessed Pope John Paul II set forth the norms for canonization. Among them, the requirement that the truth about the life of the servant of God, his virtues or martyrdom, his reputation of holiness or of martyrdom, must be sought out and discovered. That the cult given to the servant of God must be clearly demonstrated. That a miracle must be associated with his or her name. And that the importance of the cause for the Church must be shown. In 2006, Pope Benedict XVI clarified these norms, noting that a cause of beatification or canonization cannot be initiated in the absence of a proven reputation for holiness, even when dealing with people who have been distinguished for their evangelical coherence and for a particular ecclesial or social merits. And likewise, Pope Benedict insisted, the miracle associated with a candidate for canonization must be physical. A moral miracle is insufficient. In all cases, the Apostolic Constitution concluded, if the cause is to be proceeded with, all the writings of the servant of God, those not yet published, as well as each and every historical document, either handwritten or printed, which in any way pertain to the cause, are to be gathered. And meeting this last requirement may well be Chesterton's first miracle. And those who are responsible for gathering every last scrap of his writings are themselves candidates for canonization, so we may well be in the presence of future saints this afternoon. As Robert Lind wrote in 1936, in literature and journalism, he may be said to have chucked his genius about. It seems to me, Robert Lind said, it seems to me likely that we shall still for many generations to come be collecting the gold pieces that he has strewn with such magnificent recklessness. Finding those gold pieces has been the work of several lifetimes and will take several more. Chesterton's promoters will have to be patient and hard-working. But their reward will be time spent in Chesterton's company. And that surely is the point of the exercise. The goal, after all, is not to make one saint, but many saints. Well, Chesterton himself had things to say about saints and sanctity. And these too should be taken into consideration as his cause advances, if only to put in context his moral and intellectual achievement. A saint may be any kind of man, he said of Thomas Aquinas, with the additional quality that he is at once unique and universal. The one thing that separates, this is Chesterton, The one thing that separates a saint from ordinary men is his readiness to be one with ordinary men. A saint is the only sort of superior man who has never been a superior person. Chesterton's saint was both ordinary and extraordinary, unique and universal, of his time and out of his time. In some ways, Chesterton's saint was Chesterton. What do we want from the saints? Eamon Duffy has asked. The answer is that we demand from them both a sense of familiarity and a sense of otherness, of possibilities both within and beyond the reach of our own lives. And that goes for Chesterton, who, when he died, was mourned by millions of people as someone they had known but had never met, a man with whom they had enjoyed a kind of distant intimacy. We'd all have been there if we could have got off duty, said the policeman at his funeral. He was a grand man. Good God, that isn't our Chesterton, said another man who had never seen but somehow knew him. Saints help us to domesticate the holy, to enable us to grasp that it is accessible to us. To be Christ-like does not mean being less, but more like ourselves, more human, not more angelic. And that was Chesterton. So the case for Chesterton must begin then with his personal goodness. C.S. Lewis discovered his writing during the First World War, when he had ceased to believe in God. And what attracted him was not the literary brilliance, but the moral quality that lay behind it. Strange as it may seem, Lewis said, I liked him for his goodness. I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous. Hilaire Belloc spoke of Chesterton's two virtues of humility and charity. Ronald Knox at his funeral said he was a living example of charity, of chivalry, of unbelievable humility, which will remain perhaps as a more effective document of Catholic verity than any word he wrote. H.G. Wells, an antagonist, thanked him for his infinite charity. John Middleton Murray said he was much the most honourable opponent he had ever encountered. G.G. Coulton, another antagonist, said with admiration that he had sacrificed much for his faith. Chesterton himself said that he had only one virtue, and that was that he really could forgive unto 70 times 7. Father Vincent McNabb, who kissed his pen in gratitude as Chesterton lay dying, likened him to St. Thomas. With both men, he said, thought becomes consecration. The finest quality about their mental work is not its truth, but its moral worth, its goodness, indeed its holiness. Chesterton was so much better than anything he wrote or did, Father McNabb continued, that his words and deeds were but symbols of the inner source of all he said or did. And this is Father Vincent McNabb, the great, great Dominican. This constant abiding with what was highest in human thought and desire gave him that indescribable but unmistakable character of humility. He was not only the servus servorum, making all he met his masters whom he loved, in love he served, but made them all his teaching masters, from whom in gratitude he learned. So knit were his mind and soul with God, that his very laughter, so frequent and so infectious, had a quality almost liturgical. It seemed, in its own human way, a ritual worship of the truth. It was hard to speak with Gilbert Chesterton and not to think and think of God. So the writing Chesterton's writing represents only a glimpse of his soul. Everything Chesterton said, even his table talk, should be recorded, Etienne Gilson once remarked, because he was one of the deepest thinkers who ever lived. Well, holiness comes in a variety of forms. It's not the same thing as piety, although piety may be evidence of it. Holiness is rather a radical and intimate participation in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. It is not what we do that makes us holy, said Meister Eckhart. We make holy what we do. By that measure, Chesterton was holy. Everything he did, writing, speaking, teaching, laughing, was done in a spirit of consecration. His work was a prayer. His life was an extended sign of the cross, almost literally so, in his gestures with a cigar or in his drawings or his doodlings. You say grace before meals, he recorded in his notebook. All right, but I say grace before the play and the opera, and grace before the concert and the pantomime, and grace before I open a book, and grace before sketching, painting, swimming, fencing, boxing, walking, playing, dancing, and grace before I dip the pen in the ink. Well, to see Chesterton swimming, fencing, or boxing may be the third miracle that I've been looking for this afternoon. But his was unquestionably a grace-filled life. He tried to make holy by showing that they were holy already, the ordinary blessings of ordinary life, what Martine spoke of so beautifully in her paper this morning. Before writing, he said a prayer, as we read his work, surely answered. Why don't you write about God? His wife Frances once asked him. Don't you realize, he answered, I never write about anything else. Well, he was holy in other ways too. God deliver me from sullen saints, said Saint Teresa of Avila. Chesterton, echoing the idea, proposed that the soul might be wrapped out of the body in an agony of sorrows, but also in a paroxysm of laughter. His humour was of the kind which I like best, said C.S. Lewis. Not jokes embedded in the page like currants in a cake, still less a general tone of flippancy or jocularity, but the humour which is not in any way separable from the argument itself. Solemnity, and Martine again made this point so well this morning, solemnity for Chesterton was a spiritual deformity, a form of pride, almost the work of the devil. It is much easier to write a good Times leading article than a good joke in Punch. This is Chesterton. It's much easier to write a good Times leading article than a good joke in Punch. Obviously, he hadn't read the Times recently. It is easy to be heavy. It is hard to be light. Satan fell by the force of gravity. Father John was worrying this morning that by the time he came to speak, everybody would have used his own favourite quotations from Chesterton, and I'm conscious of that anxiety myself. Joy, Chesterton said, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. There was some one thing that was too great for God to show us when he walked upon our earth, and I sometimes fancy it was his mirth. If Chesterton is to be canonized, he will be a saint in the manner of Philip Neri, who said that at table I quote Philip Neri. I knew no one would quote Philip Neri today. Who said, at table, especially where there are guests, we ought to eat every kind of food and not say, I like this and I do not like that. Philip Neri also said that charity and cheerfulness, or charity and humility, ought to be our motto. We have to tell the people how to enjoy enjoyment, Chesterton wrote towards the end of his life. St. Teresa of Avila, surprisingly enough, would have approved. Laughter, charity, cheerfulness, enjoyment. Where did they come from? Chesterton experienced a great happiness and a great unhappiness in his life, and the connection between them contains the key. The happiness was his childhood. The unhappiness was his adolescence and early manhood. As for the first, his childhood, Chesterton's account of it is one of the small classics of English literature. In its own way, a form of devotional writing. What was wonderful about childhood, he recalled, is that anything in it was a wonder. It was not merely a world of miracles, it was a miraculous world. It was not merely a world of miracles, it was a miraculous world. If he had only one sermon to preach, he said, it would be that human beings are happy so long as they retain the receptive power of reaction in surprise and gratitude to something outside, a something that is present in childhood and which can still preserve and invigorate manhood. Wonder is so powerful a theme in Chesterton. That strange light of surprise in which we see for the first time things we have known all along. Wonder is so powerful a theme in Chesterton that we tend, ironically, to take it for granted. But that is, of course, to miss the whole point. Here's Chesterton again. So long as we regard a tree as an obvious thing, naturally and reasonably created for a giraffe to eat, we cannot properly wonder at it. This simple sense of wonder at the shapes of things and at their exuberant independence of our intellectual standards is the basis of spirituality. Well, this sense of the world as a brilliant surprise, as an undeserved gift, was followed, however, by a nervous breakdown. And once again, Chesterton's account of his collapse deserves a place in the literature of madness, if only for the memorable title of one chapter of his autobiography, How to Be a Lunatic. As a young man, Chesterton suffered a mental and moral crisis, the memory of which never left him, and the recovery from which marked the beginning of the joyous, celebratory note which is such a pronounced feature of his writing. The mental crisis was an experience of solipsism. I felt as if everything might be a dream. It was as if I had myself projected the universe from within. And that is so near to the notion of being God that it is manifestly even nearer to going mad. So that was the mental crisis. And the moral crisis was an experience of the reality of evil, when, in Maisie Ward's words, Chesterton reached the verge of forbidden and dangerous ground. And in his own words, he found he was playing with fire, or even hell fire. He was, as Dale said this morning, dabbling in spiritualism. Chesterton denied that he had ever experienced anything psychical, but in his own mind, there was a connection between his mental and his moral collapse. The experiences that counted for him were not exterior manifestations, but experiences inside his mind. his perception of the solid reality of evil, the self-accusation of guilt in thought, word, and deed. In loneliness and isolation, and without saying a word to anyone, he discovered the blackness of his own nature and convinced himself that it was the blackness of all human nature. And it was an idea that proved surprisingly hard to shake. "I am a man," answered Father Brown gravely, "and therefore I have all devils in my heart." Extreme evil, this is Chesterton in his autobiography, extreme evil is the unpardonable sin of not wishing to be pardoned. Why did he become a Catholic, as Father Spencer beautifully said this morning? To have my sins forgiven. Well, linked to these private nightmares was a cultural analogue to them. It would take more time than is at our disposal today to describe the extreme intellectual faddishness of late Victorian and Edwardian England, the sheer variety of ideas that competed for attention at the turn of the 20th century. Dr. John Coates, Dr. William Oddie, who is with us today, and Dr. Julia Stapleton have written brilliantly about this extreme intellectual faddishness. Skepticism, nihilism, optimism, pessimism, anarchism, vegetarianism, science as religion, religion as science. Every dogma, or lack of dogma, had its day. Chesterton poked fun at this quest for certainty, even as he too engaged in it, while also seeing its essential pathos. There was no theistic church. This is Chesterton in his autobiography. There was no theistic church. There was no theosophical brotherhood. There were no ethical societies. There were no new religions. I saw Israel scattered on the hills as sheep that have not a shepherd. And I saw a large number of sheep run about, bleating eagerly wherever a shepherd might be found, as Father Spencer said this morning, a description of our own time as well as of Chesterton's time. In his book Heretics, in his books Heretics and Orthodoxy, Chesterton, now recovered by way of metaphysical realism from his solipsistic collapse, gave his answer to those who demanded that, rather than criticizing these other philosophies, he explain his own. And he was happy to oblige, making only one qualification. I will not call it my philosophy, for I did not make it. God and humanity made it, and it made me. Free thought, he came to realize, ended in the absence of thought. It resulted in the absence of thought, in a skepticism that destroyed itself. It was idle, I quote Chesterton, it was idle to talk always of the alternative of reason and faith. Reason itself is a matter of faith. It is an act of faith to assert that our thoughts have any relation to reality at all. This is the kind of classic Cartesian response to solipsism. How to be at home in the world and to be astonished by it. How to reconcile human worth and wickedness. How to think beyond thought. Only Christian orthodoxy provided the answer. And here's Chesterton's famous answer to those questions. It's, as Dale said, yet one of those quotations that's always underlined. I had found this hole in the world. The fact that one must somehow find a way of loving the world without trusting it. Somehow one must love the world without being worldly. I found this projecting spike of Christian theology, like a sort of hard spike, the dogmatic insistence that God had made the world and had made a world separate from himself. The spike of dogma fitted exactly into the whole of the world. That's H-O-L-E, not W-H-O-L-E. It had evidently been meant to go there, the spike of dogma. And then the strange thing began to happen. When once these two parts of the two machines came together, one after another, all the other parts fitted and fell in with an eerie exactitude. I could hear bolt after bolt over all the machinery falling into its place with a kind of click of relief. Instinct after instinct was answered by doctrine after doctrine. So the sense of relief in Chesterton, I think, is hard to miss. To most people, even good people, God is a belief, wrote the poet Francis Thompson. Not our own Francis Thompson, but the poet, who is himself a poet. But to most people, even good people, God is a belief. To saints, he is an embrace. To most people, even good people, God is a belief. To saints, he is an embrace. One can almost hear in orthodoxy Chesterton's embrace of God. In sanctity, there was sanity. With holiness came wholeness. But how does this advance his canonization? Well, in several ways. Consider, in the first place, the verdict of one of his biographers. Whatever significance he has lies chiefly in the fact that at the birth of our 20th century, at a time of widespread disbelief, of rejection of accepted values, of a delight in self-indulgence, he found his way out of the modern morass by coming to accept that the beliefs of Orthodox Christianity are true. At the time of widespread disbelief, he came to find his way out of the modern morass by coming to accept that the beliefs of Orthodox Christianity are true. And as Dale said this morning, Chesterton is even more important in the time beyond his death than at the time of his death. He was, said Pope Pius XI, a gifted defender of the Catholic faith. Now, to be sure, that does not qualify him for sainthood. On the other hand, in defending the faith, Chesterton combined remarkable humility with equally remarkable courage, enduring the condescension of those who struggled to take him or it seriously. F.A. Lee puts it well. He shared the general fate of poets and prophets and all who are preeminently gifted with the power to say what they mean. No one would believe that he meant what he said. He told rationalists that they were irrational, but they only laughed. He told them that there was nothing to laugh at, and they laughed all the louder. Then he grew angry, and they were hurt. They felt he was letting them down. This is F.A. Lee, it was G.K. Chesterton's lifelong fate to be taken seriously when he was being flippant, and flippantly when he was being serious. And Chesterton puts it even better himself, describing saintliness in terms that seem also to describe his own life's work. The saint, he said, will generally be found restoring the world to sanity by exaggerating what the world neglects. This is Chesterton, each generation seeks its saint by instinct. He is not what the people want, but rather what the people need, Dale's point this morning. He is not what the people want, but rather what the people need. This is surely the meaning of those words to the first saints. Ye are the salt of the earth. Salt seasons and preserves beef, not because it is like beef, but because it is very unlike beef. And there is, of course, a paradox here. The saint must be a sign of contradiction and an object of devotion. One who warns and one who warms. And that Chesterton did both, that he both warned and warms, should by now be obvious. He combined those qualities of admonition and encouragement through sheer force of intellect and personality, so that winning minds, he also softened hearts. He lived through 2/3 of a century of remarkably bad ideas, some of them frivolous, some utterly destructive of human beings and human societies. And throughout it all, he offered, in response, what he called, in the memorable title of one of his books, the outline of sanity. Intellectuals, on the whole, resist sanity. I should know, I work with them, I know what they're like. Intellectuals, on the whole, resist sanity. They would rather have originality. Chesterton reminded them of a lesson that he had had to learn painfully for himself, that originality and original sin are not so very far apart. Forbidden knowledge is forbidden for a reason. Chesterton preferred the truth that sets us free. Consider also the manner in which he made his case. There is, about Chesterton's writing, a quality not so much of systematic argumentation, although many of his arguments are very good, but rather of rejuvenation, of effervescence, of creative unexpectedness. He was a tonic. He was a glass of champagne. He was a sustainer. Paul Claudel, welcoming him to the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1931, captured it well. His books for the past 20 years have never failed to bring me joy and refreshment. During the past century, Catholicism almost everywhere has had to sustain an attitude of defense. It preferred to take shelter in the past and in forms of refuge. Chesterton is the man who threw the doors wide open, and upon a world pallid and sick, he sent floods of poetry, of joyousness, of noble sympathies, of radiant and thundering humor, all drawn from unfailing sources of orthodoxy. His onward march is the verification of that divine saying, "The truth will make you free." If I, and this is Paul Claudel to continue, if I were to state his essential quality, I would say it is a sort of triumphant common sense, that gaudium de veritate, of which philosophers discourse, a joyous acclaim towards the splendors of the powers of the soul, those faculties that were overburdened and numbed by a century of false science and pedantic pessimism. In the sparkling and irresistible manner of a great poet, he keeps always bringing us back to that promise of Christ, "And I will refresh you, et ego reficium vos." Well, one can almost hear in these words of Paul Claudel an anticipation of the famous inaugural sermon with which Blessed John Paul II opened his pontificate in 1978. Words which are, in their own way, an unconscious summary of Chesterton's life and work. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ. To his saving power, open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. So often today, this is John Paul, so often today, man does not know what is within him, in the depths of his mind and heart. So often he is uncertain about the meaning of his life on this earth. He is assailed by doubt, doubt which turns into despair. We ask you, therefore, we beg you with humility and trust, let Christ speak to man. He alone has words of life, yes, of eternal life. every saint is a pattern, said Abbé Henri de Tourville. But no saint is a pattern of everything. Every saint is a pattern, but no saint is a pattern of everything. Chesterton, if he is a saint, is a pattern of hope, opening wide the doors to Christ and writing so well of so many things, economics, politics, the family, the state, that we may forget that in the end he only wrote about one thing, and that was God. Lord, you made Gilbert a true Catholic, and through his writings caused the faith of his readers to grow. We pray that by the example of his conversion, we might be moved to work for hope and charity as he did, and like him, give ourselves to the service of his church. That prayer was approved for private use by Jorge Maria Bergoglio, Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, in 2005. I believe he's now gone on to higher things. Without making an explicit case for it, Bergoglio's prayer is as good a summary as any of Chesterton's claims to sainthood. He caused the faith of his readers to grow. He gave himself to the service of the church. He was a model of hope and charity. He experienced conversion not once, but every day. Only one word need be added in conclusion. Chesterton was able to do all of these things because he wrote about God, as it were, not from the outside, but the inside. To the saint, as the other Francis Thompson said, God is less a belief than an embrace. That was Chesterton's view too. This is Chesterton. The transition from the good man to the saint is a sort of revolution by which a person for whom all things illustrate and illuminate God becomes a person for whom God illustrates and illuminates all things. I'll read that again. The transition from the good man to the saint is a sort of revolution by which a person for whom all things illustrate and illuminate God becomes a person for whom God illustrates and illuminates all things. For one, the joy of life is a cause for faith. For the other, rather, a result of faith. Being in some mystical sense on the other side of things, the saint sees things go forth from the divine as children going forth from a familiar and accepted home, instead of meeting them as they come out, as most of us do, upon the roads of the world. And it is the paradox that by this privilege he, the saint, is more familiar, more free and fraternal, more carelessly hospitable than we are. And that was Chesterton at his best, describing St. Francis of Assisi, another joyful saint, another powerful antidote to the mistaken tendencies of his time. Is he not also, in some deep and mysterious way, describing himself? Thank you very, very much.